Hello, welcome to chapter 14. Today we're going to talk about the brain and cranial nerves. We're going to look at all the aspects of the brain, where different parts of the brain process different information, and then all of the different cranial nerves and what they specifically do. So when our brain develops, it starts as three different sections. There's proencephalon, this mesencephalon, and this rhombencephalon. The mesencephalon is going to keep its name, while the proencephalon is going to split off to that telencephalon and diencephalon. That rhombencephalon will break off to that metencephalon and myelencephalon. These are all going to become the main parts of the brain. The cerebellum, or the cerebrum. The diencephalon keeps its name. The thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus are all known as the diencephalon. That's the main one that you need to know off of here. We'll talk about it again in other areas. The brain also has open spaces. These open spaces are known as ventricles. We'll look at them in more detail shortly, but we have lateral ventricles. We have a third ventricle. We have an aqueduct. This aqueduct is a transport between the third and that fourth ventricle. So the main parts of the brain. We have the brain stem. The bottom portion of that brain stem is continuous with that spinal cord. It has three separate sections to it, that medulla oblongata, or medulla, pons, and then midbrain. This cerebellum, this is behind the brain stem. It's in the lower portion of your skull in the back. I mentioned that diencephalon that keeps its name, thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. And then we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum, the largest part of the brain, should be a test question. But information coming into the brain, out of the brain, stuff that we are consciously aware of, like when somebody touches you, when you move something, move your arm, your leg. This is information either going into or leaving that cerebrum. So let's take a look. We have that spinal cord. Just here is where we would have that foramen magnum. Then just above that foramen magnum in the skull, we have that medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. This makes up our brain stem. Our brain stem processes autonomic type functions. It regulates your heart rate, your breathing rate. It regulates how fast or slow something's moving through your digestive system, your urinary system, your reproductive systems. A lot of different functions within there comes from the brain stem. And I mentioned that diencephalon. We have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then we have the epithalamus. Part of that epithalamus contains this gland known as the pineal gland. We'll go into more detail about it shortly. The cerebrum is this entire area through here. This is all the cerebrum. And then we have our cerebellum. this portion in the back. Behind that brainstem is that cerebellum. So here's a real brain that's been sliced in half. So we can see that medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain, for that brainstem, that diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus. We start to get, like back here, would be that epithalamus. It's just not listed. We have that cerebellum and that cerebrum again. So in the spinal cord, we talked about spinal meninges. Our brain, we have cranial meninges. These are continuous with those spinal meninges, and they are the same structures. It's just cranial for inside of the skull versus spinal around that spinal cord. So again, that dura mater, that's that outermost layer, just like that dura mater in the spinal cord. The main difference in the cranial dura mater is we have two layers. We have a periosteal layer and a meningeal layer. One that's attached directly to the skull, and then one that is more inner. There is no epidural space in the brain like there is in that spinal column, that spinal meninges. That arachnoid matter is still the middle. And then we have the pia mater, which is that inner layer. Again, we still have blood vessels in there. Another thing that they make up part of these cranial meninges is this falx cerebri. This is a portion that comes down the middle of the brain that's going to separate out our right and left hemispheres of that cerebrum. We have a falx cerebelli. Same idea. It separates the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. And then we have this tentorum cerebelli. It sits between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and it's made of these spinal meninges. So let's kind of take a look. We can see this dura mater, those two layers of that dura mater. Next, we have that arachnoid mater, that in this picture it is in pink. And then we have that pia mater that is in red. The blood vessels sit between the arachnoid and that pia mater. So here let's look at these different structures that are going to separate out the different parts of our brain. This falx cerebri, this entire tissue right here, this is found between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. We have our falx cerebelli. That is this little portion through here, but again, it's separating out that right and left hemisphere of the cerebellum. Then we have our tentorum cerebelli. This is a tissue that is separating that cerebellum from that cerebrum. So here we can see it on a real skull with a real brain. You can see that pia mater, that arachnoid mater, that dura mater, and we can even see this falx cerebri coming down. So the brain blood flow. So we send blood to our brain through the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. The vertebral arteries travel in those transverse processes, those transverse foramen. The vertebral artery go through those transverse foramen up into the skull. Well, that internal carotid is going to go through the carotid canal in the skull. We drain blood that's going to leave through sinuses. A sinus is an area where blood collects and before it drains out of the skull. So we have these dural venous sinuses that are going to drain into the internal jugular veins. And this is the blood that is leaving the skull. About 20% of the oxygen and glucose used by our body is used directly by the brain. That's a pretty large amount. We mentioned the different types of ways to make energy in the skeletal muscle chapter. The brain uses almost exclusively glucose through anaerobic respiration, or aerobic. I read that wrong. Through aerobic because we're using that oxygen. So if we're using that oxygen and that glucose, we are using aerobic respiration. So when the activity of the neurons and those neuroglial cells, those support cells to our neurons, when their activity increases, so does the blood flow to that area. So a brief slowing of blood to the brain can cause disorientation or lack of consciousness. It can cause you to pass out. An interruption for 1 to 2 minutes can stop neuron function. And total oxygen deprivation, so losing complete oxygen to a certain area, it only takes 4 minutes to cause permanent injury. That's not a lot of time. So if you have low glucose in your blood, there's a lot of different mental things you're going to see or feel. That mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and again, that loss of consciousness. That's all from low glucose in the blood. So your brain's not getting enough glucose to function. This blood-brain barrier. Blood does not come in direct contact with the brain, as we kind of mentioned in chapter 12. We use endothelial cells of these blood or brain blood capillaries to help create this barrier. Those cells are those astrocytes that we mentioned in chapter 12. These astrocytes are going to maintain these tight junctions around these capillaries. So they're only going to allow certain substances to get through. Lipid-soluble substances and water molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, alcohol, barbiturates, nicotine, and caffeine, these can all cross that blood-brain barrier. And they do it by diffusion. These water soluble, like glucose, they're going to use facilitated transport. Most proteins and antibiotic drugs, they cannot cross that blood-brain barrier. But if there's some kind of trauma or damage within the brain, it can cause different substances or things to break down that blood-brain barrier. Toxins, inflammation, these can break down that blood-brain barrier. So there's lots of really cool research out about how to get certain substances to cross that blood-brain barrier, specifically for brain cancer or other central nervous system disorders. One idea is a sugar solution, because this glucose can cross that blood-brain barrier through that facilitated transport. So if they somehow put these drugs inside of glucose or sugar solutions, what they're doing is causing these endothelial cells of these capillaries to shrink. It's going to open the gaps between their tight junctions, which make them more leaky and allow different drugs to get in. People with brain cancer, it was never an option to do chemotherapy because it wouldn't cross that blood-brain barrier. But because of some of these different research methods that they have, these different methods they found through research, they've been able to take some of these substances and get them across that blood-brain barrier using this method, which can help shrink some of these cancer tumors growing. Cerebral spinal fluid. So we make this cerebral spinal fluid. It's colorless. It's mostly water, and its job is to protect the brain and the spinal cord from injury. There's oxygen, glucose, and other chemicals that our brain and these neurons need to survive. This cerebral spinal fluid is constantly circulating around the brain, the spinal cord, through the different ventricles that I had mentioned before, and I will mention here again shortly. So this cerebral spinal fluid is constantly moving through, and it is found in the subarachnoid space. Last question. There's about 80 to 150 milliliters or 3 to 5 ounces of this cerebral spinal fluid between the brain and the spinal cord. Again, we have our glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, these different cations, anions, and white blood cells are found in this cerebral spinal fluid. This cerebral spinal fluid, it's made in the ventricles, and it travels through the ventricles to be found within in the middle of the brain and around the brain. So we have 2 lateral ventricles, one in each hemisphere. They have the septum pellucidum between these ventricles. The third ventricle is found superior to the hypothalamus and between the right and the left halves of the thalamus. And then our fourth ventricle is between the pons and the medulla, anterior to the cerebellum. So here's a better view of it, of this whole ventricular system. Those lateral ventricles, we have a right and a left, that drain into the third ventricle. The third ventricle is going to drain into this cerebral aqueduct. This cerebral aqueduct is going to drain into that fourth ventricle. From here, it's going to follow paths to come up and around the brain on the outside. It can go down that central canal of the spinal cord, or it can even travel around the spinal cord on the outside of that spinal cord. So our cerebral spinal fluid provides this protection. It's shock absorbing. So its goal is to prevent the brain and spinal cord from hitting any bony walls. Our brain actually floats in that cranial cavity in cerebral spinal fluid. It provides a chemical protection. It has this chemical environment for neuronal signaling, so our neurons can function at their best because of the environment our cerebral spinal fluid keeps. And then it circulates. So it allows for exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and that nervous tissue. So waste products from that nervous tissue get secreted out into that cerebral spinal fluid, which is then going to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream so our body can get rid of these waste products. We have choroid plexuses found within the ventricles that is going to make our cerebral spinal fluid from capillaries. Those ependymal cells, they allow certain substances to be filtered from the blood plasma, mostly that water. But it allows that glucose, those different ions, oxygen, and they work bidirectionally. So certain substances get secreted into the cerebral spinal fluid. Waste products are going to go back into the bloodstream. For something to get into that cerebral spinal fluid, it has to pass through those ependymal cells. So we have a blood cerebral spinal fluid barrier even. This is helping to protect our brain from harmful substances. So I like pictures. Here we can see this choroid plexus. Here it kind of travels this whole length of these lateral ventricles here. That's what these are in this picture, those lateral ventricles. They are lined with these ependymal cells that make up this choroid plexus. So this cerebral spinal fluid is going to get secreted out here by this choroid plexus. We have choroid plexuses in the lateral ventricles, the third ventricles, and the fourth ventricle. So cerebral spinal fluid that gets secreted out through the lateral ventricles are going to travel through this interventricular foramen. From here, it's going to enter into this third ventricle. The third ventricle is going to drain through the cerebral aqueduct. This is aqueduct of the midbrain, same thing, to enter into this fourth ventricle. From here, this cerebral spinal fluid can travel out and around the brain. It can continue down the central canal of that spinal cord. It can travel around the outsides of that spinal cord, back up around, up and through, filling in any spaces that we may have here. But it's helping to protect that brain and spinal cord cushion and allows that brain to completely float. So here we can see it from another view. We just see those lateral, that choroid plexus found in those lateral ventricles, that third ventricle that goes through that cerebral aqueduct to this fourth ventricle, which is then going to kind of travel around outside of the brain, through that central canal, around the spinal cord. So here is a really nice summary. It shows all the different ventricles, what the cerebral spinal fluid has to travel through to get to all of these different areas, and how the cerebral spinal fluid keeps circulating, get rid of waste products, come back up, and make more cerebral spinal fluids. We're constantly making the cerebral spinal fluid as we're emptying out the cerebral spinal fluid that has already been circulating around. This leads us to hydrocephalus. This is where cerebral spinal fluid either is not being reabsorbed or we're making too much cerebral spinal fluid. It causes excess accumulation of the cerebral spinal fluid. And in a baby, their skull has not fully fused together yet. All the separate bones in that skull have not come together. So because of this increase in pressure, their skull starts to expand and this fluid starts to build up in the skull. Eventually, it can compress down and cause damage to the brain. The way that they treat this is they're going to put a shunt that goes from that skull, and it's going to drain down into the abdomen where it's going to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream. Adults with hydrocephalus, it can happen after a head injury, meningitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage, but because the bones are already fused, it can be life-threatening very quickly. So let's start going through the parts of the brain. We're going to start from the brainstem and work our way up. So the medulla oblongata, or medulla, it's just fun to say oblongata. This is just above that foramen magnum inside of the skull. It is the lowest portion of that brainstem. We have white matter, which is sensory tracts and motor tracts. We're also going to have what are known as pyramids. So there's these bulges on the anterior aspect. These pyramids is where those cortical spinal tracts pass from that cerebrum to the spinal cord. Cortical is the cortex. Spinal is what's it's the second part of the word is its destination. So this is your voluntary movement. Those pyramids are also going to desiccate. So they're going to cross sides. And as I've mentioned in the last chapter, this is why the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Is because of this crossing over of fibers. So here is this medulla. You can see these parts that kind of bulge out a little bit here. Those are the pyramids found within the medulla. They're just kind of areas where this kind of bulges out more. So here you can see these pyramids better in this medulla. You can see this desiccation of the pyramid. So where they're crossing sides. So what do we have in our medulla? I mentioned our brain stem tends to control more functions we don't have control over. So we have a cardiovascular center. So the rate and the force of your heartbeat, the diameter of your blood vessels are all controlled by your medulla. We have a respiratory center known specifically as the medullary respiratory center. This is the area that makes adjustments to your normal breathing pattern. We have reflex centers for vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping, all found in the medulla. We have olives. So we have an inferior olivary nucleus. This is receiving input from the cerebral cortex, the red nucleus of the midbrain, and that spinal cord. So this is where activities are regulated. So of those cerebellar neurons, they're going to provide instructions that the cerebellum uses to make adjustments to different activities. When you learn something new, remember your cerebellum is monitoring whatever you're doing. We mentioned that in the last chapter when we talked about all of these different pathways of everything. Well, these olives are helping connect to that cerebellum so it can make those different adjustments. We have a gracile and a cuneate nucleus. This is where touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So you consciously knowing where your body is in space. A nucleus, remember from chapter 12, is where cell bodies are found in the central nervous system. So cell bodies for touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception are traveling through one of these two nuclei when it's going up to the brain. That's that cerebrum. We have a gracile fasciculus and a cuneate fasciculus. These are tracks. That go from the spinal cord to these specific nuclei to synapse there. From here, that information is going into the thalamus on the opposite side of the brain. We mentioned in chapter 13 that medial lemniscus. This is part of that posterior column medial lemniscus pathway that is taking sensory information to the thalamus on the opposite side of the brain. We also have several cranial nerves that come out of the medulla. So let's look at these. We have the vestibulocochlear nerves. So this is sensory input coming into this vestibulocochlear nucleus, and it's going to provide motor output to that cochlea to help with hearing and equilibrium. So that balance. glossopharyngeal nerves. So these nuclei are going to relay sensory and motor for taste, swallowing, and salivation. Vagus nerve. This nerve receives sensory and provides motor to the pharynx, larynx, and the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So viscera are those organs in the chest and the abdominal cavity. We have the accessory nerve, the cranial portion. The cranial portion of accessory nerve controls swallowing through the vagus nerve. There's more that the accessory nerve does. We'll look at it when we get to the cranial nerve portion of this lecture. And then we have hypoglossal nerves. They control tongue movement during speech and swallowing. So what happens if this medulla gets injured? Well, because we have our cardiovascular and we have respiratory centers in there, it can be fatal. Damage to that respiratory center can lead to death. So a non-fatal injury to the medulla, we can have cranial nerve malfunctions on the same side of the body as that injury. Paralysis and loss of sensation on the opposite side of the body. Irregularities in heart rate and rhythm, that breathing. An alcohol overdose is going to suppress that rhythmic center, so that breathing and heart rate, which can cause death from an alcohol overdose. The next one up, we come to our pons. We have nuclei and tracts found within our pons, just like we did in the medulla. The pons kind of acts as a bridge that connects parts of the brain with another area in the brain. So some of these axons are going to connect the right and the left sides of the cerebellum together here. There's parts of ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts that go through the pons. We have a ventral region, which we have a pontine nuclei in the ventral, which is the anterior portion. This helps to connect the cerebral cortex and the opposite hemisphere of the cerebellum. It also does coordination and that efficiency of voluntary motor output. The dorsal region has ascending and descending tracts with nuclei of cranial nerves. We also have a pontine respiratory group. It's going to control breathing with the medullary respiratory center. You go into a lot more detail about what these medullary and pontine respiratory centers do in Anatomy 2 when you get to the respiratory chapter. So let's look at what cranial nerves are found in the pons. We have trigeminal. Trigeminal does sensory to the head and the face, and motor for chewing. Abducens controls eye movement. So it's going to allow your eyes to move. we have facial nerve. Facial nerve, facial expression. Also saliva, does sensory for taste, and it does tears. And the last cranial nerve in the pons is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This vestibulocochlear nerve, balance and equilibrium, and sensory from hearing. So, vestibulocochlear nerve goes through the pons and part of that medulla. So, it's going in, it's kind of found between both of these areas. Next, midbrain or mesencephalon. It's usually known as just the midbrain, and it is superior to the pons, and it's below that diencephalon, that thalamus. The cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. We just talked about the different ventricles and the pathway of that cerebral spinal fluid. Well, that cerebral spinal fluid goes from the third to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, and that is found in the midbrain. We have cerebral peduncles. This is corticospinal, corticobulbar, and corticopontine tracts. So this is carrying information from motor areas in the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, medulla, and pons. We have the tectum, which are 4 round elevations in the midbrain. 2 of them are the superior colliculi. The superior colliculi is reflex centers for visual. So, eye movement for tracking, moving images, and scanning stationary images. This is also movement to head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual stimuli. So, you hear something behind your shoulder. It allows you to turn your head to look. That's a reflex to turn and look when you hear something. Or if you see something go flying across your field of vision, it allows you to turn and respond to that. We also have our inferior colliculus. Again, there are 2 of these, and it's part of that auditory pathway. So that startle reflex is coming from this inferior colliculi. Sudden movements of the head, eyes, and trunk from that loud noise. So this is where the superior and that inferior colliculus works together. I mentioned before, when you hear something over your shoulder, it allows you to turn and look. That inferior colliculus, that loud noise, or somebody yelling over from behind you, and superior colliculus lets you move that head, eyes, and trunk to follow. Substantia nigra is found in the midbrain. It is darkly pigmented, that's why it's called Niagara. These neurons release dopamine to the corpus striatum, so it's controlling subconscious muscle activities. These neurons play a role in Parkinson's disease. We have a red nucleus. Again, it's named for its color. So axons from the cerebellum and cerebral cortex come here for muscle movement. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor nerve. Again, it allows you to move your eyes just like abducens. Cranial nerve 6, oculomotor nerve 3 also helps. Constriction of that pupil, which is a autonomic response, and changing in that lens shape. So as you move something you're reading closer or further away, it's changing the shape of that lens so you're able to see. And then my other cranial nerve, trochlear nerve, is the third nerve that allows you to move your eye. Oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, all three of those cranial nerves let you move your eyes around. So here you can see the superior colliculi with the inferior colliculi, these four circular bumps that come up. We have our cerebral peduncles off to the side here. You can see trochlear nerve. I think that's everything in the midbrain. So here, if we see a slice across, you can see that red nucleus, that substantia nigra coming out. We have the oculomotor nucleus with that oculomotor nerve coming out. We mentioned the cerebral aqueduct. Here's just that superior colliculus. So let's look at the reticular formation. You can see the reticular formation here. So here's this reticular formation. This reticular formation is going to work to do several different functions. This reticular formation contains the reticular activating system. That is the ascending portion of this reticular formation. We also have descending motor functions that are going to come out of this reticular formation. But this reticular activating system, it's going to take in visual, auditory, mental activities, stimuli from pain, touch, pressure receptors, and receptors on our limbs and head that keep us aware of the position of our body parts. The reticular activating system plays a role in consciousness, which is that state of wakefulness. Visual and auditory stimuli and mental activities help to maintain that consciousness, help to keep you awake. Arousal is that wakening or awakening from sleep. Attention, being able to concentrate on a single object or thought, that is done through that reticular activating system, as is alertness. So one of the jobs of our reticular activating system is to prevent sensory overload. So what it does is it filters out insignificant information so it does not reach your consciousness. So there's always going to be some things, noise going on around you. Most of it is going to get filtered out so you can pay attention to what you're supposed to. That is helping to prevent this sensory overload. If you heard everything going on around you at all times, if you saw all kinds of extra lights flashing, things going on, it's a lot of sensory overload. This reticular activating system gets rid of some of that so you can focus on what you need to. When the reticular activating system is inactivated, it produces sleep. The interesting thing, this reticular activating system, if it gets damaged, it results in a coma. And this coma may be non-reversible unless this reticular activating system is actually able to repair itself. Because when the reticular activating system, when I just mentioned it's inactivated, you go to sleep. When it's activated in the morning, that's what wakes you up. Helps with your muscle tone, heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. Now the interesting part. There is no input from smell into that reticular activating system. So when you're sleeping, this is why we have smoke detectors in our homes. This reticular activating system will not wake you, smell will not wake you up. So the smell of smoke will not wake you up from sleep because there is no input from smell. We have input from hearing. We have input from taste, sound. No input from smell. So smells cannot wake you up. So here is this reticular activating system, this whole reticular formation, everything that makes it up. All of these arrows are showing we have auditory and equilibrium impulses coming in. We have visual impulses coming in from the eye. We have sensory impulses coming in from the body, and it's going out all over the cerebral cortex to help you process information and focus on what you need to with filtering out what you don't need. Let's go into the cerebellum. That cerebellum back here behind the brainstem. There's lots of folds in it. And it's just like the cerebrum has different fissures that separate it out. So did the cerebellum. We'll go through those when we get to the cerebrum. We have a transverse cerebellar fissure. We have that tentorium cerebelli that we mentioned before. We have a vermis. And then we have a right and a left cerebellar hemisphere. We have an anterior and posterior lobe that helps with subconscious skeletal muscle movement. We have a flocculonodular lobe, equilibrium and balance. We have a cerebellar cortex. The cerebellar cortex has gray matter and white matter. The arbor vitae is the white matter. And then we have different cerebellar nuclei. This is information that is going from the cerebellum to other areas of the brain. So here is this cerebellum. I mentioned the vermis. We have a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. We're looking down on it. Now, if we look underneath, We still have that vermis with the posterior lobe, but here we see that flocculonodular lobe. Here we can see it from the side. We see that cerebellar cortex, that gray matter, that cerebellum. We have 3 cerebellar peduncles. This is what attaches that cerebellum to the brainstem. So our superior cerebellar peduncle, axons from the red nucleus that go off to several nuclei of this thalamus. So this is where these axons are traveling. We have the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is the largest. Axons for voluntary movement from the pontine nuclei into the cerebellum. And then we have our inferior cerebellar peduncle. So that spinal cerebellar tracts for sensory information from proprioceptors from that trunk and limbs. That vestibular apparatus needs to play into it for sensory information from proprioceptors in the head. The inferior olivary nucleus. They're going to help regulate the activity of cerebellar neurons. Then axons from the cerebellum to the vestibular nuclei and the cerebellum to the reticular formation all go through those that inferior cerebellar peduncle. The cerebellum is going to evaluate how well movements by that motor area in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. So your cerebrum puts together this movement plan for you. This information goes out to your skeletal muscles to allow your skeletal muscles to contract in a certain order. Your cerebellum is monitoring this. It fine-tunes these movements. So when these initiated movements are not being done correctly, that cerebellum is going to detect any discrepancies and it's going to send feedback to correct those. Coordinate, it helps to coordinate muscle movement. It regulates your posture and your balance. So lots of different skilled activities like catching a baseball, dancing, and speaking are all regulated through the cerebellum. We also have these reciprocal connections between that cerebellum and association areas of that cerebral cortex. It's thought to help with cognition, language processing, learning, and responding to anticipated rewards. So what happens if there's damage to that cerebellum? Well, ataxia could be one of those. So that inability to coordinate muscle movements. Blindfolded people with ataxia can't touch their finger to their nose. They cannot sense where their nose is located on their face. Could be changes in speech patterns, staggering or abnormal walking. If you have ever seen somebody drunk, alcohol inhibits that cerebellum, so it cannot control or correct movements. This is why people who are drunk cannot walk in a straight line. You tell them to close their eyes and touch their finger to their nose. They can't do it because they can't sense where their nose is. Again, because that cerebellum is inhibited. There's a lot of different coordinated tests to check cerebellar function, like taking your hand and hitting your other hand, palm up, palm down, palm up, palm down as fast as you can. People with damage to their cerebellum or too much alcohol that's inhibiting their cerebellum can't do that. But ataxia can also result from other things like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, trauma, brain tumors, genetics, or even medications. There are certain medications that can actually inhibit that cerebellar function as well. So let's keep moving our way up the brain. We have our thalamus. The thalamus is the main part of this diencephalon. There's several nuclei in the thalamus, and then there's lots of different tracts. We have an interthalamic adhesion, and this is what connects that right and left side of the thalamus together. We have an intermedullary lamina. These are axons that enter and leave the different thalamic nuclei. We also have this internal capsule. This is what connects the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So here in blue, this is the thalamus. This little portion here is that interthalamic adhesion, connecting that right and left sides of the thalamus. Here you can see the names. These are all different nuclei located in this thalamus. So there's a lot of different nuclei here. You don't need to learn them all here. If you go on and take advanced, like graduate level anatomy classes, that's where you will learn more of this information. So the thalamus is a relay station. It is known as the main relay station in the brain. Best question. So sensory impulses are going to travel through the thalamus. Motor going down or transmitting information from that cerebellum and corpus striatum and the primary motor cortex helps to play a role in maintaining your consciousness. All of these different nuclei here, like your limbic system, emotions, memory. We've got the medial, emotions, learning, memory, and cognition. This lateral, expression of emotion, integration of sensory information. So there's a lot. And then these ventral ones, movement control, more movement, touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, proprioception, geniculate. Actually sends information from vision. We have a medial geniculate, which is for hearing. So these different nuclei are sending off this information. Information goes into these specific nuclei that are then being sent off to the proper area in the brain to make you aware of some of this stuff. We have intralaminar nuclei, more for that reticular formation, corpus striatum, areas of that cerebral cortex for arousal, sensory, motor. Another nucleus, paravertebral, memory, olfaction or smell. And then we have this reticular nucleus of the prethalamus, monitors, filters, and integrates activities of the other thalamic nuclei. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has many different areas to it. The posterior hypothalamic area has the mammillary nuclei for reflexes to the sense of smell. Intermediate hypothalamic contains this infundibular stalk to connect the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And then we have the medial eminence around that infundibular stalk. We have the anterior hypothalamic area. We have a preoptic area. So there's a lot of different areas in the hypothalamus. But what does it do? It's going to control many body activities. It regulates homeostasis in our body. The hypothalamus is regulating that homeostasis. That hypothalamus is regulating your homeostasis. It's going to come back to you in anatomy too. So, sensory information. Visual, receptors for vision, taste, and smell go through this hypothalamus. Osmotic pressure, blood glucose, hormone concentrations, and temperature of the blood are all monitored in your hypothalamus. It helps to control this autonomic nervous system. So it helps to regulate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Heart rate, movement of food through the digestive tract, and contraction of the urinary bladder come through this hypothalamus. Hypothalamus produces hormones. Not only does it help to maintain homeostasis, it's the main function of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is going to send out either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. Releasing causes other hormones to be released. Inhibiting prevent hormones from being released. It also makes oxytocin an antidiuretic hormone. These hormones then get transported to that posterior pituitary gland where they get released. This will come back in the very first chapter of Anatomy 2. Regulations of emotional and behavior patterns. It works with that limbic system, which is known as that emotional brain. So expressions of rage, aggression, pain, pleasure, behavioral patterns related to sexual arousal are all done in the hypothalamus. It does a lot. Regulates your food intake. We have a feeding center, a satiety center, which is supposed to help you feel full, and a thirst center, which is supposed to stimulate that sensation of thirst to help you to tell you you're thirsty to drink something. It controls your body temperature, so it controls that thermostat in the body. If the temperature of the blood that goes through that hypothalamus is normal, it'll maintain that certain body temperature. If the temperature of the blood is above normal, it'll cause that autonomic system to promote heat loss through sweating. If that blood is temperature is below normal, it'll send out heat production types like shivering, goosebumps to try to generate heat. Your circadian rhythm. We have the chiasmic nucleus that maintains that biological clock. So that circadian rhythm, that 24-hour cycle. So we receive input from our eyes for light, the reticular formation, and our pineal gland all play a role in the circadian rhythm because that visual input gives us that light-dark cycle. Daylight during the day, darkness at night. Without that input, we still are able to maintain these different biological rhythms, but it'll be out of sync. And what it does is it creates this cycle that goes about 25 hours instead. We need to receive these dark light cues to maintain that 24-hour cycle. So here, this shows this hypothalamus, all of these different nuclei. Here's this pituitary gland that was mentioned with that infundibular stalk that connects the hypothalamus to that pituitary gland. And this is all different areas that are regulating and monitoring different functions around the body. Then we have our epithalamus. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland. This pineal gland produces melatonin. This is part of the endocrine system, so this will come back in anatomy 2 as well. But melatonin is one of those hormones that helps to regulate those circadian rhythms, that 24-hour clock. So, in response to light, it stimulates that pineal gland to secrete melatonin. Low levels of melatonin are always secreted out. At night, when it's dark, even higher, like a significantly higher amount of melatonin gets released. That change in melatonin that's being secreted out can change your sleep pattern, can wake you up. So this melatonin can promote sleep. It actually serves as an antioxidant. It inhibits the reproductive function in certain animals. When taken orally, because you can buy melatonin in the supplement section at most stores, it can help set that body's biological clock to induce sleep. There's a lot of studies out that show that this is a way to help adjust to jet lag faster. So when you travel somewhere with a significant time change, taking some melatonin can help your body to adjust to that new time difference or coming back. I did it where I traveled a full 12-hour time difference. I had no problem over there, probably because I was excited and somewhere fun and new. But I had a really hard time adjusting when I came back. Melatonin was the only thing that really helped. There's a nucleus found within the epithalamus for that sense of smell, and it is emotional responses to odors. that travels through this habenular nuclei. Circumventricular organs, this is around that third ventricle. So here, our body monitors changes in blood. There is no blood-brain barrier in this area. And it has parts of that hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and pituitary gland in this area. Why? Well, as we're monitoring the blood, it's helping to maintain those endocrine and nervous system functions. That endocrine are those hormones. So we're monitoring chemical levels. We need to monitor hormone levels in the blood for that hypothalamus. So we know we need to release out releasing hormones versus inhibiting hormones. We monitor blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, and thirst. The problem is because there is no blood-brain barrier, this is one of the main sites of entry for HIV to get into the brain. Once in the brain, it can cause dementia and other neurological disorders. The cerebrum. The cerebrum is known as the seat of intelligence. The cerebrum has gray matter on the outside and white matter more on the inside. It has billions of neurons. Within the cerebral cortex, we have sulci, which are grooves that separate neighboring gyri. So we have areas that go up and down. A gyri is a portion that sticks up. A sulci is one of those areas that goes down. We have interlobar, sulci, which is going to separate out the different lobes. We have cerebral fissures. They're separating out different parts of the brain. We have a longitudinal cerebral fissure. This is separating that brain into right and left halves or cerebral hemispheres. And then we have this corpus callosum, which is a connection of the right and the left hemisphere from the inside. So let's look at all of these different lobes. If you remember your different bones of the skull, this will be easy. Frontal bone, frontal lobe, parietal bone, parietal lobes, temporal bone, temporal lobes, occipital bone, occipital lobes. We have a central sulcus that is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. We have a precentral gyrus located just in front of that central sulcus. This is the primary motor cortex. We have a postcentral gyrus just behind that central cerebral sulcus, and this is the primary somatosensory cortex. So any sensory information from the body is going up to that primary somatosensory cortex. Any motor that is coming out for motor movement goes through that primary motor cortex before it goes out to those muscles. We have a lateral cerebral sulcus, separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. We have a parieto-occipital sulcus, or a lambdoid sulcus. Separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And then we have this part of the brain that is known as the insula. It is underneath the parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes. So let's look. Here, you can see that gyrus. You can see a sulcus going down. Here you see that lateral longitudinal cerebral fissure. That's also what you see here, is this longitudinal cerebral fissure that is separating that brain out into right and left sides. Here is this precentral gyrus, which is just this area right here. We have our post-central gyrus. Yeah. It kind of comes down from there. That is that post-central gyrus. And what separates that precentral gyrus from that post-central gyrus is that central cerebral sulcus. Here we have our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. From the side, again, you can see that precentral gyrus, that post-central gyrus that is separated by that central cerebral sulcus. We have our frontal lobe. Here you see the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. We can also see that lateral cerebral sulcus between that frontal lobe and temporal lobe. We can see that parieto-occipital sulcus, also known as the lambdoid suture on the skull. Here it's the parieto-occipital sulcus. And then you can kind of see this insula found on the inside of that brain. So I mentioned the white matter and the gray matter before. So we have cerebral white matter, myelinated axons. We have association tracts. And this is taking information between cerebral gyri in the same hemisphere. We have commissural tracts. Nerve impulses from the cerebral gyri in one hemisphere to the corresponding gyri in the other hemisphere. They get there through the corpus callosum and the anterior and posterior commissures. And then we have projection tracts. This is information from the cerebrum to the lower parts of the central nervous system, or from the lower parts up to that cerebrum, also known as the internal capsule. This is ascending and descending tracts from or to that cerebrum. So here we can see all of this happening. Here is this corpus callosum, this whole area here that I kind of just colored in yellow. Then we have our association tracts, these commissural tracts going from one side to the other, and then you have this anterior commissure as well that is sending off information from one side of the brain to the other. So you can see these neurons and how they're traveling from one area to another, or they're coming down to these commissural tracts are going to the other side. And then those projection tracts that are sending information up or down. So sensory up, motor down. So the corpus striatum, or also known as basal nuclei. This is, nuclei is gray matter because it is cell bodies. It is part of this internal capsule, and it's going to go through to control subconscious contractions of skeletal muscles. So, muscles are going to help to maintain your posture. So, the globus pallidus and the putnam are also known as the lentiform nucleus. So, this globus pallidus, muscle tone. Putnam precedes or anticipates body movements. And then we have this caudate nucleus, eye movements. This corpus striatum, initiation and termination of movements. So the first thing you need to do to be able to take a step or to stop walking. Initiate and terminate cognitive processes, attention, memory, planning, and it may work with that limbic system for emotional behaviors. Parkinson's, OCD, schizophrenia, and chronic anxiety have to do with circuits with this corpus striatum in the limbic system. So here you can see that caudate nucleus, the putnam, the body of that caudate nucleus coming up and around, even the tail of that caudate nucleus, the thalamus found in the middle between it all. This is all areas that are making up this corpus striatum. You can also see it if we slice the brain a different direction and then we highlight the different nuclei. This corpus striatum is made up of all of these different nuclei, which are these darkened segments within the brain. We also see this internal capsule, which are all of these fiber projections going up into that cerebral cortex. So our limbic system. Our limbic system is known as that emotional brain. Everything highlighted here is everything that makes up this limbic system. So emotions, it's going to display different emotions for pain, pleasure, docility, affection, and anger. Olfaction and memory come into play in the limbic system. They found through some research studies that if they stimulate the amygdala, which is a part of this limbic system, in a cat's brain, it actually produces patterns of rage. If they remove the amygdala, they now lack fear and aggression. So somebody whose amygdala is damaged in this limbic system, they don't recognize fearful expressions in others or express fear in situations that would be normal. Somebody who's scared, standing at like certain heights, their amygdala is damaged. These people don't express these same behaviors. They don't see a problem with any of it. So all of this in green here make up all of the different parts of this limbic system. There's a lot of different areas that play into this emotional brain. So besides processing and displaying emotions, it plays a role in your memories. So if there's damage to that limbic system, there's going to be you're going to have problems with memory. The hippocampus, another area of this limbic system, It also plays a role with memory and may develop new neurons and neuron connections as memories are formed. So let's go into more of the cerebral cortex. We mentioned that primary somatosensory cortex. This is behind that central cerebral sulcus. We have one on the right and one on the left, and this is going to receive information for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, and proprioception, and somatic sensations. We have a map of the entire body found in this primary somatosensory cortex. It is known as the sensory homunculus. It is a map that will pinpoint and let you know if somebody touches you on your shoulder, you know somebody touching your shoulder. If there's a fly or a mosquito by your arm that moves the hairs on your arm, you're able to know where that is to swat it away. The primary visual cortex, more sensory, is in the occipital lobe. So anything you are seeing is going directly into that occipital lobe, mostly on the medial side. The primary auditory cortex is on that temporal lobe. So all sound, anything you hear, is going into that temporal lobe. While anything you taste, that gustatory cortex is in the insula. The insula lets you know that you're tasting something and what it is. And then that olfactory cortex is also in that temporal lobe. So smell, that is olfactory. So here's a nice highlighted brain that shows all of these different areas. So we have that primary somatosensory cortex, that central sulcus, mention that primary visual area, primary auditory area. I was looking for that. They're not showing me the insula. That's why. Now we get that gustatory and that olfactory. So on this insula in here, this insula is helping to process taste. So you know what you are tasting. Our motor areas. We have a primary motor cortex. And again, just like on that sensory portion, we have a sensory homunculus, which has the entire body present on that one region. We have a motor homunculus that again has every body part on it. So when motor information comes into this primary motor cortex, it's able to send out to tell which muscles to contract to perform which activities. So skilled, complex, or delicate movements are coming out of this primary motor cortex. We have our premotor cortex, which is in front of that primary motor cortex. So impulses are sent to the primary motor cortex for planned movements. So when it goes to that from the premotor cortex to that primary motor cortex, it allows specific groups of muscles to contract, either simultaneously or in a sequence, to allow you to walk, to allow you to sit down, to allow you to stand up, to allow you to pick something up. You need certain muscles to contract in a certain order. This premotor cortex contains what's known as a memory bank for movements. So it stores how to do certain movements that you have learned how to do. we have Broca's area. Broca's area is known as motor speech. So this is the area that allows people to be able to move their mouth and tongue in a certain way to produce words. And most people, this is found only in the left hemisphere. If somebody may suffer a stroke in this area that contains Broca's, they're not able to form words. This is known as non-fluent aphasia. And then we have our frontal eye field. This frontal eye field controls scanning movements of the eyes. So allows your eyes to kind of scan what's going on around you. Let's come back up here to my brain. So we have this primary motor cortex. In front of that, we have our premotor cortex. In front of that, we have our frontal eye field. We mentioned Broca's area. That is that motor speech area that allows you to form words. Let's go to our association areas. So we have a somatosensory association area. It is behind the primary somatosensory cortex. And this allows you to determine the shape and texture of objects you're feeling. So that primary somatosensory cortex lets you know you're feeling something. That association area lets you know what you're feeling. It stores these previous sensory experiences so the next time you touch something, you remember what it was. We have a visual association area found in that occipital lobe. This association area lets you know what you are looking at. So information goes into that the primary visual area to let you know you're looking at something. That visual association area lets you know what you're looking at because it's relating it to present and past visual experiences to know what is being seen. We have a facial recognition area and part of that temporal lobe. So it stores information about faces. This is what allows you to recognize people by their faces. That right hemisphere is usually more dominant than that left. This is why you can recognize somebody's face, but you may not always remember their name. We have a specific area that allows you to remember people's faces. We have an auditory association area. Again, in that temporal lobe. This is what helps you recognize speech, music, or noise. So again, you're able to know you're hearing something, but then that association area lets you know what it is. We have an orbitofrontal cortex. It's that lateral part of that frontal lobe. Here, it is allowing you to identify odors and to discriminate amongst different odors. So that primary olfactory cortex lets you know you're smelling something. That orbitofrontal cortex is letting you know what it is you're smelling. Again, it's usually greater in the right hemisphere. We have an area known as Wernicke's area. This is pretty much in the left temporal and part of that parietal lobe. This is what allows you to understand what you are seeing or hearing. So it interprets the meaning of speech and words, and it's active when you're translating those words into thoughts. It's more dominant in the left hemisphere. So somebody who suffers a stroke in Wernicke's area, they can still talk. Because Broca's area is that area that lets them speak. Wernicke's area lets you understand what you're hearing. Well, if you have a stroke, they can talk because Broca's area is in place, but they're not able to put together sentences that make sense. So they're just a bunch of random words that come out. It's kind of known as a word salad because it doesn't make any sense what they're actually saying. We have a common integrative area. It's around the somatosensory, visual, and auditory association area. So information is coming in from taste, smell, the thalamus, and part of the brainstem. So this is where we interpret information along with forming thoughts based on those sensory inputs. So when you eat something or smell something and you think, oh, that smells good, that's coming from this common integrative area. Or you taste something, you're like, oh, that tastes really good. Common integrative area is sending that information. And then our prefrontal cortex. It's the anterior part of that frontal lobe. It has connections with most of the brain. Somebody's personality, intellect, complex learning abilities, recall of information, initiative, judgment, foresight, reasoning, conscious, intuition, mood, planning for the future, and development of abstract ideas all come out of this prefrontal cortex. If there's damage bilaterally, people become rude, inconsiderate, incapable of accepting advice, moody, inattentive, less creative, unable to plan for the future, incapable of anticipating the consequences of rash or reckless words or behavior. Hemispheric lateralization. This is the small differences between the two hemispheres, the right and the left. 2/3 of the population, Wernicke's area, is on the left side. And it's 50% larger than the right side. So this asymmetry that happens in the brain tends to start being noticed about 30 weeks of gestation. So each hemisphere is going to specialize in different functions. So lateralization in females is not as drastic as it is in males, but both speech, language, and visual spatial skills are done on different sides of the brain. This is also what gives us that right-handedness versus left-handedness, is this hemispheric lateralization. Test question. So here is a nice chart that kind of shows the difference between that right hemispheric functions and those left hemispheric functions. Like people who are more quote unquote right-brained, they're more musical and artistic. While people who are more left-brained are better with reasoning, numerical, and scientific skills. They're ability to use and understand sign language, spoken language is better, while somebody who's right hemisphere is able to identify and discriminate different odors better. Brainwaves. So there's ways to monitor what is happening with the brain, and that is through monitoring brain waves using an electroencephalogram or an EEG. These electroencephalograms can only monitor what is happening in the cerebral cortex. Next question. We have 4 different types of waves. We have alpha waves. This is in most normal people. It's when they're awake and resting, and they can disappear when somebody is fully asleep. This is when you're just kind of relaxing, not doing anything. Beta waves. These beta waves is when you have some sort of mental activity, sensory input is occurring. Theta waves. Theta waves are normal in children and adults with emotional stress. And delta waves. Delta waves are during sleep in adults, but they are normal in an infant that is awake. If we see theta waves in an adult who is awake, there's usually some sort of brain damage. And all 4 of these different waves are test questions. So this shows what these different waves look like. You can see in the alpha waves when somebody is just relaxing, they're not mentally stimulated, versus the beta, these people are mentally stimulated. These waves are moving much quicker. Those theta waves. Those theta waves are found in children or adults of emotional stress. And then these delta waves, when we're sleeping or in an infant. Brain injuries. Brain injuries, it's usually because of some sort of head trauma, because of displacement and distortion of neural tissue at that specific moment of impact. Brain cells can recovering from strokes or a cardiac arrest tend to release out free radicals. These free radicals are damaging because they disrupt cellular DNA and enzymes, and they alter plasma membrane permeability, which can cause hypoxia, that oxygen deficiency. A concussion is a type of brain injury. It's temporary. These people can lose consciousness. They can see disturbances in vision, and they can have problems with their equilibrium. What happens in a concussion is their brain hits up against the bone of their skull. This is the most common form of those brain injuries. People can have a headache, drowsiness, nausea and or vomiting, lack of concentration, confusion, or post-traumatic amnesia. They don't remember what happened. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is a very progressive order caused by repeated concussions. You see it primarily in athletes of contact sports like football, ice hockey, and boxing. But you can also see it in combat veterans, And what happens is this tau, which is a protein in this brain, can start to clump up. It can start to build up and tangle. These clumps can kill brain cells, and then they start to spread to neighboring tissues, killing them off as well. These different changes, here's the scary part, can begin months, years, or even decades after the last brain trauma. Memory loss, confusion, impulsiveness, erratic behavior, impaired judgments, depression, paranoia, aggression, difficulty with balance and motor skills, and eventually dementia are going to come into play. Right now, there is no treatment or cure for this. At the time your textbook was written, the only way to diagnose this for 100% was an autopsy of the brain tissue. They are working on coming out with different MRI, CT scans that can work on identifying some of this. I had a student who was a football player for me who wrote an entire paper on this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and I got some really good information from his paper on different ways they're working on how to diagnose this. Another one, traumatic brain injury. This is an intracranial injury, and it's usually a result of an external force to the head, like car accidents, contact sports, physical activity, falls, violence, explosive blasts. People can have symptoms that range from mild to moderate to more severe. So these mild, they may lose consciousness, headache, slurred speech, confusion, lightheadedness, dizzy, blurred vision, tinnitus, fatigue, sleep disturbances, memory loss, behavioral or mood changes, difficulty with memory, concentration, attention, and thinking. While somebody who has more moderate to severe, they can have all the same symptoms, but they may have more severe chronic headaches, repeated nausea and vomiting, convulsions or seizures, dilation of one or both of their pupils, numbness in their limbs, loss of coordination, and the inability to wake from sleep. These people usually need some sort of rehabilitation program. So those of you going into physical therapy assistant, you're going to see these people, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. They're also going to need psychological and usually psychiatric treatment, as well as different social support to be able to make it through all of this, because there's a lot of steps to trying to recover. A contusion. A contusion is bruising due to trauma, where blood leaks from these microscopic vessels. It's usually associated with a concussion. That pia mater can be torn, which allows blood to enter that subarachnoid space, usually that frontal lobe. And these people will lose consciousness, they lose their reflexes, they may stop breathing, and their blood pressure may drop. But their vital signs usually kind of stabilize not too long after the contusion happens. And then a laceration is a tear of the brain. A skull fracture or a gunshot wound is the most common cause of a laceration. What it does is it causes ruptures of the larger blood vessels, which cause bleeding into the brain, that subarachnoid space. So they may end up with this hematoma or pooling of blood. edema, which is that swelling, and increased intracranial pressure. So if you have this swelling, there's limited space, and it can cause excruciating headaches. These are the kind of headaches where people tend to describe them as a headache like they've never experienced before. This brain tissue is going to start to undergo necrosis. It's going to die off. The brain can even herniate through the foramen magnum, and that causes death as well. So these are some nice charts from your textbook. It goes through all of the different parts of the brain and their function, starting from the brainstem, like we did in this chapter, and working our way up. So now we're going to go into our cranial nerves. Our cranial nerves are nerves that come off of the brain, and majority of them do something with the face, the head, and the neck. We have 12 pairs, so we have a right and a left, and they are considered part of that peripheral nervous system. Only cranial nerves 1, 2, and 8 are sensory. So, smell, seeing, and hearing are those sensory functions. Cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 are motor only. So they're going to different skeletal muscles. And then cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, and 12 are mixed nerves. It should be 10, as I'm sitting here thinking. That should be 10. There we go. Because they have sensory and motor attached to them. So let's look at all of these different nerves. Those of you going into nursing are going to need to know all of these nerves and how to test them. It's people going into dental hygienists, there's going to need to know a lot of these nerves that go especially to the mouth. Physical therapy, you're going to have to know most of these as well, because you're going to need to know how to test these. Respiratory function, you're going to have to know respiratory therapists. So there's a lot, there's reasons to know these nerves and know them well. So cranial nerve 1 is known as olfactory nerve. It is that sensory. Olfactory has to do with smell. These neurons specifically are those bipolar neurons that we mentioned in chapter 12. And they are going to detect odors. These are unmyelinated axons. So this information does travel somewhat slow. These olfactory nerves are going to synapse into these olfactory bulb. We'll see this more when you look at chapter 17. And this olfactory bulb makes the beginning of these olfactory tracts that makes its way to the olfactory cortex and that temporal lobe. So here you can see this olfactory nerve, these nerves that are coming down. This is that olfactory bulb. This is the crimpiform plate of that ethmoid bone. All of those holes in that crimpiform plate allow that olfactory nerve to send its processes down to allow that sense of smell. Here you can see these olfactory bulbs that make up part of this olfactory nerve here. Anosmia is that loss of smell. Infections, if you get a really stuffy nose, you notice how your sense of smell just isn't that good. People who get COVID sometimes completely lose their sense of smell. That's why knowing how to test cranial nerve 1 is important nowadays, because it wasn't necessarily as important, but still important. But now, since COVID, it's even more important because people lose that sense of smell. So the way to test this is to expose people to different smells. And you usually have them close their eyes and ask them what they can smell. And it's usually something people are familiar with. Coffee, peppermint is usually another one people are usually pretty familiar with. Cinnamon is another one. Those are types of things you can ask people to smell with. People who get head injuries. Sometimes that can damage that cribriform plate. Lesions of that olfactory pathway. Meningitis, an infection of those meninges that causes from bacteria. Smoking or cocaine use can also cause you to lose that sense of smell. So here is that olfactory nerve highlighted out on the brain. I love these pictures from your textbook because it shows just that one nerve. You may see the rest of these cranial nerves off of here, but you see that one nerve specifically highlighted. Cranial nerve 2, optic nerve. Again, entirely sensory. This optic nerve allows you to see. As we'll learn in chapter 17, we have these rods and these cones that stimulate these visual impulses that allows you to pick up different or be able to see what different things. They follow this pathway. We have an optic chiasm where these nerves are going to cross. Some of these nerves are going to cross over, and they're going to follow this optic pathway all the way to that occipital lobe. So this kind of shows these different neurons. We have these rods and these cones that are picking up the different visual stimuli that travel down these neurons, down these next neurons, down these next neurons to make up this optic nerve. This is all coming from the back of your eyeball to that optic nerve to this optic chiasm here, which is this cross. Here on a brain, you can see specifically this optic nerve and then this optic tract. Here is this optic chiasm. It's this whole crossing area. Now we're going to do 3 nerves in one because they all allow movement of the eye. We have oculomotor, cranial nerve 3, trochlear cranial nerve 4, and abducens cranial nerve 6. They allow your eye to move. So oculomotor. Oculomotor controls the most in the eye, cranial nerve 3, because it's going to go to medial rectus, inferior oblique muscles, and it also carries parasympathetic to those eye muscles. That's going to control the shape of the iris and the lens. It also goes to superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris, which allows you to open your eyes. Orbicularis oculi lets you close your eyes. Levator palpebrae superioris lets you open your eyes. Cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve. Cranial. This nerve specifically will go to superior oblique muscle. So it only goes to one muscle. Abducens. Cranial nerve 6. This one goes to lateral rectus, just one muscle. To test cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, what eye doctors usually do is they have you follow their finger when they move their finger around, usually in this kind of H pattern, and then they have you, as they move it closer, your eyes come into the middle together. That's usually the way that you test cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. So here you can see these 3 nerves and where they come out of the brain. What I usually remember is abducens goes to lateral rectus, trochlear goes to superior oblique, everything else goes to oculomotor, because these are going to be test questions. So if I remember what abducens goes to, and I remember what trochlear goes to, and then I just know everything else goes to oculomotor, it makes it a lot easier to remember. Strabismus, damage specifically to that oculomotor nerve. So both eyes, if it's to both eyes, may turn inward or outward. They end up usually with some sort of double vision. Ptosis is drooping of that upper eyelid, because that oculomotor nerve goes to that levator palpebrae superioris. But it also has dilation of the pupil, movement of the eyeball, that accommodation, so you're not able to focus, and diplopia, which is double vision. Damage to abducens. That eyeball cannot move laterally. It leads to that strabismus and diplopia. There's damage to oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. These nerves, it could be trauma to the skull or brain, compression from an aneurysm, or lesions to the superior orbital fissure. So here's that oculomotor nerve coming out. Here's that trochlear. And then cranial nerve 6. We skipped 5 for now. We'll come back to 5 in a second. There's abducens. So if we notice, if we're paying attention, oculomotor, well, here's 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. You notice they travel in order down the brain. They're going to continue to do so. Trigeminal. Trigeminal nerve is that mixed cranial nerve, so it's going to have motor and sensory. It is our largest cranial nerve. We have 3 branches to it. We have an ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, and a mandibular branch. This mandibular branch, for those of you wanting to go into dental hygiene, your lower teeth are innervated by that mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. It's also going to do sensory for the tongue, not taste, but being able to feel something on your tongue. That's trigeminal. That ophthalmic is doing sensory to most of the face. Maxillary does sensory to most of the face. It does do motor. That muscles of mastication is that motor. So chewing. Movement is also done by that trigeminal. So here is that trigeminal, that large, very large nerve that's coming out just below cranial nerve 4. Trigeminal neuralgia. This is pain to that trigeminal nerve. Could be from inflammation. It could be because of some sort of lesion. It can be a cutting or tearing sensation, lightning type of sensation carried along that trigeminal nerve. It's almost exclusively for people over 60 years old. Multiple sclerosis, diabetes, lack of B12. This is all stuff that can damage that trigeminal nerve. That mandibular branch can prevent people from chewing. They're not able to detect touch or temperature to their face or mouth. So here's that trigeminal nerve. So again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just continues to move down. Then 6, we already went over. Next nerve, facial nerve. Again, it's a mixed cranial nerve, and it is going to allow for facial expressions. It is the muscle of facial expression, which is why it's facial nerve. It also has parasympathetic fibers. So those lacrimal glands, so crying, nasal glands, runny nose, palatine glands, sublingual, submandibular, so production of saliva. It also does proprioception. So here's that cranial nerve 7. You can see it going out to all of these different areas of the face, going into those nasal cavity, going into those salivary glands, that tongue. So there's cranial nerve 7. So we had cranial nerve 6 here. Now 7, we're starting to move back out. Cranial nerve 8. Vestibulocochlear nerve. It is made up of 2 separate nerves, 2 branches anyways. We have a vestibular portion that does your equilibrium or balance. So in our ears, we have semicircular canals, a saccule utricle, and these are working to maintain your balance, your equilibrium. So your body kind of knows what direction you're going. If you're in a car moving forward, if you're in an elevator moving up and down, this vestibular branch is sending that information into your brain. And then we have that cochlear branch for hearing. There's also some motor, but it's mostly considered that sensory cranial nerve. So here we can see this vestibulocochlear nerve coming out. We have that 6, 7, and now 8. You can see it on that brain. 6, 7, 8. Glossopharyngeal. Cranial nerve 9. This nerve does your taste buds for the posterior third of your mouth. It does proprioceptors for swallowing. Baroreceptors, so they're detecting the blood pressure in that carotid sinus. It does chemoreceptors, so it is monitoring the oxygen levels. The external ear for touch, pain, and thermal sensations. This nerve, the way to test cranial nerve 9, actually somebody's gag reflex is a good way to test this cranial nerve. Not fun for the patient, but it is a way to do it. So here you can see that cranial nerve 9. Coming out, you can see it going to that parotid gland. So it's providing saliva again for the mouth. And it's doing that baroreceptors, chemoreceptors. It's doing taste to the posterior third of the tongue. Somebody who loses or injury to that glossopharyngeal nerve, dysphagia, they cannot or have difficulty swallowing. Those of you going into nursing, every patient has to have that swallowing checked. There's people who need to swallow pills versus finding other ways to get them instead of finding out later when they're choking. They can have decreased saliva, aptalia, loss of sensation of the throat, ageusia, loss of taste, and that gag reflex. That pharyngeal reflex is supposed to prevent choking. It's that back of the mouth, roof of the mouth, the back of the tongue, and the area around the tonsils can stimulate that gag reflex. So people with hyperactive pharyngeal reflex have difficulty swallowing pills, and people with a hypo, so below active pharyngeal reflex, may have problems swallowing pills because they're having difficulty swallowing. These people may also be very sensitive to medical and dental procedures. So there's that glossopharyngeal nerve. And if we go down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you can see how it's just traveling down the brain. Vagus nerve. Vagus nerve has branches that go to the head, or from the head and neck into that thorax and abdomen. It does do sensory to your ear, pain, temperature, does taste buds in the way back of your throat, proprioceptors to the muscles of your neck and throat. This also has baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, but to the carotid sinus, but it also does the aortic. So there's two different places that we're monitoring blood pressure and we're monitoring blood composition. The carotid sinus and that aortic. Sensory from visceral receptors. So that's most of the organs in your thoracic and abdominal cavity. Can send hunger, fullness, and discomfort. This does a lot. There's motor neurons that go to the pharynx, the larynx, which is the back of the throat, into the voice box, that soft palate for swallowing, vocalization, coughing. So a way to test this vagus nerve, yes, is you can ask somebody to cough. You can have them stick their tongue out and say, ah, the back of that soft palate will rise up. And that's another way to check that nerve. We do parasympathetic to the lungs, hearts, any glands in the digestive canal, smooth muscles to the lungs, esophagus, stomach, gallbladder, small intestine, and most of the large intestine are receiving parasympathetic, so that rest and digest, to that vagus nerve. So this vagus nerve does a lot. So here's all of these different areas along the way that this vagus nerve is hitting up. And here is this vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. If we count it out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 2 more to go. Vagal neuropathy. This is where sensations are from the different organs are not coming in. Again, dysphagia, so people have difficulty swallowing, but tachycardia, because again, it's parasympathetic to the heart that rests and digests, so it slows down your heart rate. Well, if that vagus nerve isn't working, it can cause an increase in heart rate. The exact opposite. Cranial nerve 11, accessory nerve. This actually comes from that anterior gray horn, from the first 5 segments of that spinal cervical portion of the spinal cord. It will go back up into the skull through that foramen magnum and then leave through that jugular foramen. Motor to sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles, as well as proprioceptors to those specific muscles. So this one, you can have people shrug their shoulders up and try to push them down. And that's checking that trapezius muscle. If that trapezius muscle works, it has that strength, accessory nerve works. So here you can see that nerve coming out to the sternocleidomastoid and that trapezius muscle. You can also see here how it's coming from these first 5 cervical segments. So here is that accessory nerve. And our last cranial nerve, hypoglossal. This is motor to the muscles of the tongue. So speech, swallowing, you can have people stick their tongue out, move it to the right, to the left. That's checking that hypoglossal nerve, letting you know that it's working functionally. So here's that cranial nerve 12 that's going to the muscles that are going to move your tongue. So here we have hypoglossal. We can go through cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We have all 12 cranial nerves. So this chart from your textbook goes through all of the different cranial nerves and its main function. This goes through the rest of it. There are some mnemonics to learn the cranial nerves. There's a lot of them on Google. Some people learn better with something that's more inappropriate than others, but knowing all your cranial nerves is important. You will need to know them. There are test questions on these cranial nerves and how they work. So being able to put that information into use, besides knowing them when you get into your specific fields, when you get into your specific classes, they're going to expect you to already know your cranial nerves. And then they're going to start going through how those cranial nerves are important to that specific career. So our nervous system comes from that ectoderm. That ectoderm forms that neural plate. So here we form this neural plate, this neural crust. This is all part of that ectoderm. It's going to fold in and make this neural fold. Eventually, we end up with this neural tube. Then we start, by week 3, we start to get that proencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon. By week 7, we have that telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. That by the 11th week, we start to get what starts to look somewhat like a brain. So that brain is going to grow very fast in those first few years of life. Growth is due to the increase in size of neurons that are already there. As neuroglial, those support cells, they're going to proliferate and grow. More dendritic branches are going to come out, and myelination of axons are going to continue to happen. By the time somebody reaches the age of 80, their brain usually weighs about 7% less than it did as a young adult. The number of neurons don't get smaller. It's just the number of synaptic contacts that go down. So one nerve connecting to the next. There's also a decreased capacity for sending this nerve information out. So being able to process information goes down. That conduction velocity, how fast that information goes out. Voluntary movement slows down. Reflex times are going to increase. Cerebrovascular accident, also known as a stroke. This is the third leading cause of death in the US, and it's where certain neurons in the brain die due to a lack of oxygen. It may be from a blood clot that cuts off blood supply to a certain area of the brain. That's an ischemic stroke. It can be from that fatty plaque buildup. A blood clot can form anywhere in the body, and then if it gets knocked loose, it can travel anywhere in the body. If it gets stuck in the brain somewhere, it'll block off blood supply to an area. And as we read before, 4 minutes is all it takes for those neurons to die. It can also be from a leaky or ruptured blood vessel in the brain because of blood pressure that is too high. This is why it's important to monitor your blood pressure, overtreatment with anticoagulants, so preventing blood from clotting, or just weak spots in blood vessels caused by an aneurysm. That is a hemorrhagic stroke. That is the rest of the other types of strokes. So that ischemic stroke is where blood is blocked off because of a blood clot. Here it's that fatty plaque buildup. That hemorrhagic stroke is because blood is leaving the blood vessels into the brain somewhere. Once those neurons or brain cells are dead, it cannot be reversed. Again, 4 to 6 minutes is all it takes. And these neurons start dying at 1.9 million cells per minute. The longer it is left untreated, the more damage is going to happen. These people usually have weakness or paralysis on one side of the body. You usually see facial drooping on one side of the face. They have trouble speaking, understanding, visual problems, headaches, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, excessive alcohol intake, illicit drugs. If you have a family history of stroke, over the age of 55, African Americans have a higher risk, and males have a higher risk. And if you've had a transischemic attack, that's where a blood vessel gets blocked off for a short period of time, not enough to cause damage, because the blood pressure behind it is enough to cause that blood clot to move on. But if you've already had one of those, you're more likely to have a cerebrovascular accident. Again, treatment is going to depend on where the damage is. There's different medications that they can use, those anticoagulants, to prevent those blood clots from happening. Surgery is possible, physical therapy. The cool thing with physical therapy is they can retrain a different area of the brain to pick up some of the slack from that area of the brain that got killed off. I've watched physical therapy before where they're retraining somebody how to walk because the area of their brain where they knew how to walk got damaged from a stroke. So now they have to relearn how to walk. And a different area of the brain is kind of picking up that slack from the blood vessels that were originally, or from that area of the brain that was originally knew how that got damaged. Again, that transischemic attack, I already mentioned what it was. So it's that temporary cerebral dysfunction because of an impaired blood flow. These people are weak, dizzy, numb, may have paralysis on one side of the body, drooping of one side of their face, headache, slurred speech, difficulty understanding speech, partial loss of vision, double vision, nausea, vomiting. These symptoms only last 5 to 10 minutes. It's very rare for them to last up to 24 hours. There usually are some permanent neurological defects, but it's not as bad as a stroke. Again, blood clots, atherosclerosis, blood disorders. About 1/3 of patients who have a transischemic attack will have a cerebral vascular accident. So again, they're going to give those anticoagulants to prevent blood clotting. And cerebral artery bypass grafting, where they take an artery from somewhere else in the body and they transport it up into the brain. A carotid, removing the cholesterol plaques from those carotid arteries or wherever that may have been from. Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive dementia. It is the loss of reasoning and ability to care for oneself. About 11% of the population over 65. So this is the 4th leading cause of death. We don't know what causes it. There is some evidence to genetic factors, but environmental and lifestyle factors, and it could be just part of that general aging process. But we have found they have found mutations in 3 different genes that can lead to early onset of Alzheimer's. Environmental factors like head injuries. These people usually start out with having trouble remembering recent events, things that they just did. They can be confused, forgetful. They're repeating questions. They ask a question, got an answer, ask the same question again because they don't remember what the answer was. They can get lost while traveling to familiar places. That disorientation just continues to grow. They continue to forget more things from the past. And it starts to bring on paranoia. They get paranoid because they don't know what is happening. They can have hallucinations. As their memory continues to go, they're going to lose their ability to read, write, talk, eat, and walk. They usually die of some sort of complication. These people usually end up bedridden, a lot of times pneumonia, just because they're losing that ability to walk, talk, communicate with anybody. So there's, based off of research, what is actually happening in the brain is there is a buildup of toxic waste products, which causes neurons to degenerate, especially in the basal nucleus. Basal nucleus uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. The hippocampus is another place because it forms that memories. We get these beta amyloid plaques that are going to start to build up. They become toxic, these beta amyloid plaques, as they build up, which causes neurons to die. We also see these neurofibril tangles, which is from those proteins, tau, that we mentioned earlier. This tau causes microtubules in these neurons to lose their stability. And this is what causes death of some of these neurons. There's research through different imaging that shows There's a possible relationship between these accumulation of these plaques and tangles, cerebrospinal fluid, and sleep. Another reason to sleep. I'm going to keep passing them on. So during stage 4 of these non-REM sleep, which is your deepest level of sleep, cerebrospinal fluid flows into and out of our brain, cleansing every 20 seconds. It's cleansing everything in there. This is known as neural brainwashing. What it does is it's going to flush out these beta amyloid plaques and these neurofibrillary tangles. And it's going to pass them into the lymphoid system, the cardiovascular system, where they're eventually going to be broken down. There's still some research that needs to show more about this. So they're trying to figure out different drugs that may help with this neurofibril or this neural brainwashing that's helping to clean out these plaques, these neurofibrillary tangles, to prevent Alzheimer's or prevent the progression of Alzheimer's, the killing off of these neurons. Brain tumors. This is abnormal growth of brain tissue. It can be malignant, which is cancerous, which will probably transfer somewhere else in the body, and they can also be benign. They can be serious because they, especially in an adult skull, as they continue to grow, they're going to push down on brain tissue. So most malignant tumors, they're usually secondary tumors that have metastasized from other cancers in the body, like lung, breast, skin, blood, or lymphatic. Most common are gliomas, which are from those neuroglial cells, those support cells. People experience, again, a headache like they have never felt before, poor balance and coordination, dizziness, double vision, slurred speech, nausea, vomiting, fever, abnormal pulses, breathing rate, personality changes. Your symptoms are going to depend on where the tumor is growing and what type of and what tissue is being pressed up upon and being damaged. Surgery, radiation, and or chemotherapy. The problem is, we mentioned with that blood-brain barrier, that chemotherapy does not cross over that blood-brain barrier. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. This is a learning disorder or short attention span. Consistent levels of hyperactivity. These people have impulsiveness, inappropriate for the child's age. It's usually diagnosed in children. It is thought that 5% of children have ADHD. Boys are usually diagnosed more than girls. It usually begins in childhood and it continues into adolescence and through adulthood. Often before the age of 4, symptoms may be noticed. They have difficulty organizing and finishing tasks. Attention to detail, lack of. They have a very short attention span, inability to concentrate, difficulty following instructions, talking excessively, and frequently interrupting others. Frequent running or excess climbing, inability to play quietly alone, difficulty waiting or taking turns. We don't know exactly what causes it, but it has a very strong genetic component. If one parent has it, the kids are most likely going to get it. There is some evidence that shows that it has problems to do with neurotransmitters. An interesting thing is there's been some imaging to show that ADHD have less nervous tissue in specific regions of the brain. That frontal temporal lobe, the caudate nucleus, and the cerebellum. There are remedial education that can be done for these kids. behavior modification techniques. They these kids need very structured routines, and they'll usually get to a point where drugs are needed to help them kind of focus through school. And that is everything on this chapter. Thank you very much for listening and have a wonderful rest of your day.